and yet possessing everything. You know, it's funny sometimes how things work out. As I prepared for this morning, I could read this passage with a great sense of inspiration and passion, and yet I struggled with what I was reading and I couldn't figure out why. Finally, it took me quite a while, but finally I remembered that what I was reading was from a seminary class I took my first quarter in seminary. I was in a class on 2 Corinthians. I was in a higher level class right off the bat because I had a degree in religion and Christian education, and they let me petition out of some of the lower classes, the beginning classes, and I was thrown right in with other second level students and even some PhD students. The whole class was on 2 Corinthians. This is the very passage that I wrote my very first major paper about in seminary. The title of my paper actually was Paul's Ministry of Reconciliation, a Theology of Self-Affirmation. I set out to show that although the list of hardships presented in this passage have been understood as a way Paul was living out the Christian life with afflictions, with hardships, calamities, beatings, imprisonments, riots, labor, sleepless nights, hunger, I believed that countless women had internalized the spirit of this message so that no matter what damage it caused to them, either physically, emotionally, or spiritually, they thought that was the best way to live their lives. There are passages in the Bible that appear to be blatantly anti-woman, like, let them, women, be silent in the church, from 1 Corinthians 14, or I permit no woman to teach, from 1 Timothy 2. These passages appear to be overt in their expectations of women, yet they can be openly debated. I have a 70-page paper on women's leadership roles in first century Christianity and the Greco-Roman culture that argues against many of these passages. What we're taught from a passage like this one on reconciliation and hardships is more subtle, more insidious, more evil and dangerous for women than most of us even know. Not all women have a desire to speak or preach in the church, but the roles of our society do call for women to be reconcilers, to sacrifice the self, to endure hardships. Women are taught the Christian characteristics of charity, meekness, obedience, humility, self-abnegation, sacrifice, and service. These are attributes of nurturers and caregivers, positions traditionally expected to be filled by women. Now, I could read my paper to you. I could preach on the evils of oppression, and maybe someday I'll share the paper with you. What I want to do today, though, is to tell you a story about Marjorie. Marjorie is an emergency room nurse who happens to be a seminary student as well, taking a class called Preachers in Search of Their Voices. On the very first day of her class, students were asked this question: what is the best memory of a sermon or preacher that had a positive impact on your life? I invite you over the week to think about that. What sermon or preacher had a positive impact on your life? The students in this class found it difficult to answer that question, and each one had to figure out for her or himself over the course of the class how to make sense of this question. During the third class session, Marjorie was ready to share her experience. Marjorie began by telling the class that the sermon she most remembered actually began on Tuesday night before the Sunday she heard the message. Now that might sound crazy, she said, but it was a message that God had been formulating in her before she ever heard these words from the pulpit. That Tuesday night was a busy night in the emergency room, and 2 nurses had called in sick. Marjorie agreed to stay on until more help could be recruited. Things were just getting under control when a man burst through the doors and walked up to her desk. his arm tightly around a woman wrapped in a man's overcoat. The coat looked like a cape. It had just been quickly thrown over her. The woman was huddled down inside the coat with the collar turned up. Marjorie could see her little eyes peeking out, all puffy and dark purple. The man was yelling that he wanted to see a doctor right now. His wife had slipped on the icy porch steps in her high heels. Marjorie looked down and saw that the woman was wearing tennis shoes. Inside, Marjorie had some doubts about what she was hearing. Marjorie did recognize this couple from her church. Although she didn't know them personally, she had seen them from her place in the choir loft on Sunday mornings. They sat on the right rear of the sanctuary, towards the back. She remembered seeing the husband sitting with his arm tight around his wife, as it was now in the emergency room. If the couple recognized Marjorie from church, they pretended not to. The man insisted that he be allowed into the examination room with his wife. Somehow Marjorie managed to get the woman away from her husband and into the room alone. One of the doctors motioned Marjorie over to the side and asked if the woman had fallen down the cellar stairs with a load of laundry again. That was the story from the previous month. After the woman's wounds were treated, Marjorie offered the hotline number of a shelter for battered women. The wife refused, and through her bruised lips, she said, "I'll go home. I just want to go home. I'll be okay." The next Sunday then, following this Tuesday night, the man and the woman were in church. Marjorie, before heading up to the loft, the choir loft, she heard an usher ask what had happened. The woman had 7 stitches over her right eye. The husband, answering for her, said, "Oh, I could just kick myself for not having cleaned off the ice on the front steps. She fell down." He sounded so convincing that Marjorie almost believed him. From the choir loft, she could look down and see the couple near the back on the right. The husband with his arm held tightly around his wife, that same strong hold that he'd used bringing her into the emergency room on Tuesday. Marjorie began to listen to the hymns that were sung and the prayers offered in light of that battered woman's experience. As the congregation prayed, "Oh God, we have sinned against you," by claiming more than is ours, Marjorie watched the woman mouth those words and knew in her heart that those were not the words she needed to pray. The woman had not claimed too much for herself. She needed to claim more. Now, Marjorie didn't remember the name of the hymn, but she knew that it too was not what the woman needed. The hymn reinforced the idea that humanity is too full of pride. And then the sermon. The sermon was based on 2 Corinthians 5, the passage just before what I read this morning. It's on the ministry of reconciliation. The sermon message was, "Since God did not count our trespasses against us, we must not count our trespasses against each other." The preacher painted a picture of what life might be like for friends and neighbors, husbands and wives, even nations, if they could only forgive one another. The wife had a faraway look in her eyes. The husband was taking in every word he heard the pastor say. This sermon did not confront the abuser with what he had done only a few nights earlier. Instead, it seemed to reinforce the okayness of it. All his wife needed to do was forgive him. God would forgive him. The man was hearing that God would not hold his trespasses against him, and his wife was expected to forgive. I thought about Marjorie's story of the battered woman as I read through the list of Paul's hardships, which is found right after the words about being called to the ministry of reconciliation. I reread them in light of the woman's experience. This is what I read, and this is what I heard from the wife's perspective. We are putting no obstacle in anyone's way. Oh, how I try not to be an obstacle, so that no fault may be found with our ministry. I try so hard not to do wrong. I don't want him to find fault. But as servants of God, we have commanded ourselves in every way through great endurance. Oh, yes, great endurance. In afflictions, hardships, calamities, beatings. I know what Paul's talking about. Imprisonments, riots, labor, sleepless nights. Oh, the sleepless nights. By purity, knowledge, patience, kindness, holiness of spirit, I try to be the good, loving wife. I try so hard. Genuine love. What is genuine love? I don't know anymore. Truthful speech. Oh, I have to be so careful with what I say. And the power of God. Where is the power of God in my life? With the weapons of righteousness for the right hand and for the left. The only one with weapons in his right and left hands is my husband. In honor and dishonor. It's so hard to go to church looking like this, knowing people must be wondering. In ill repute and good repute. We are treated as impostors and yet are true. I've lost my sense of truth. As unknown and yet are well known. I'm only known by my husband. I have no friends. As dying, and see, we are yet alive. Just barely sometimes, just barely. As punished and not yet killed. Not yet killed. As sorrowful, yet always rejoicing. How do I rejoice in this? How? As poor, yet making many rich. Who? How? As having nothing, and yet possessing everything. No, I possess nothing. I have nothing. I am nothing. This woman was hurting in an incredible way. And not only that, she was locked into a system that did not allow her to get out of it. The Christian thing to do was to suffer the hardships as Apostle Paul had done. There were no other options offered to this woman. She'd heard other passages that told her to take up her cross, to deny herself, to be a servant, to forgive 70 times 7 with no reference to the harm that might be causing to her. These are imperatives. Do this, and you will live a Christian life. Your life will be pleasing to God. And what was her husband hearing? Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza, a German theologian, offers a different perspective for Marjorie as she read this quote in Fiorenza's book, Bread Not Stone. Fiorenza wrote, "While theology often advocates for men a theology of relinquishment, feminist theology articulates for women a theology of self-affirmation. This is something that many women in the church do not hear. That it's okay to take care of oneself, that it's not wrong to stand up for the self." In a later book, Fiorenza speaks of kyriarchy instead of patriarchy. Kyriarchy is the power over position anyone takes over another person. It's not just men over women. There are women in power over other women, and even some have power over men. The point is that the sermon preached on that Sunday morning, that sermon that impacted Marjorie's life, was a sermon based on a theology of relinquishment for those in a power over position. It was for the kyriarchs, not for those who had less power. The message was for them to become servants, to be gracious to others, to strive for reconciliation, to relinquish their power for the sake of others. And that pastor that morning assumed that everyone present in that congregation had the ability to choose relinquishment. He assumed that the battered woman, and then more than likely others in that sanctuary, that they needed to hear a sermon that would support what has been taught for centuries, that all must give themselves up for the sake of others. I found an interesting article this week on the Assertive Spirituality website, written by Deborah Leiter, titled "When Christian Nice Demonizes Self-Care." Leiter saw a post by a male Christian that suggested we serve others rather than ourselves. She analyzed all the problems with that much too prevalent statement as a one-size-fits-all rule, especially when put into a context that helps demonize self-care for many in unhealthy ways, much like the woman in Marjorie's story. Leiter believes that in many expressions of the Christian faith, especially those with a strong, what she calls Christian nice component, accommodation to others is seen as the highest form of spirituality. No matter what's going on in your life, we give up for the sake of others. Leiter says it's possible to take care of oneself so a person can be healthier in taking care of others, and even in seeking help from others if needed. And others can take care of themselves and ask for help as well if they need it. Each of us has certain strengths and weaknesses so that we can mutually help one another, and that can be a beautiful thing. Here's the thing, though. There are people who need to hear that we are called to love others more than ourselves. For those with a lot of privilege, this kind of statement is often needed. Unfortunately, those people, like the husband in our story, have been accommodated to too much. This kind of one-size-fits-all theology sees accommodation and service to others as the highest good, and that's what often harms women, the poor, and other marginalized people. There are two sisters, Emily and Amelia Nagoski, who wrote a book called Burnout, about how some people in patriarchy and other unhealthy systems are allowed to be human beings. They are the ones who have the option of either serving or being served, while others are expected to be human givers only. Women, minorities, poor people, and other marginalized populations are often expected to be the givers in society. And unfortunately, these groups are too often scorned for having needs or desiring time for self-care. The human beings in this kind of society, the human beings, often exploit the labor of human givers. I thought about these essential workers during the height of COVID, that there were people who expected people to be at fast food restaurants, to be at grocery stores, to refill the shelves at Walmart, to be there when the privileged needed them or wanted them in place. And even if those human givers were needing time to take care of themselves or their families, it was scorned upon, it was frowned upon. How dare you not work when there's work offered to you? This expectation of needing to give to be worthy often leads to the genuine ill health for the human givers, through burnout and through trauma. Burnout and trauma are often connected to negative health consequences. This means that the human giver syndrome literally hurts people. Therefore, the serve others rather than yourself theology is really, literally unhealthy when it gets internalized by the giving populations. It literally hurts people when paired with the message that it's immoral or wrong to take care of ourselves. When the human givers in society internalize this message, they grow to believe that they are not really valuable humans unless they are willing to give to others. Human givers often need to hear most that they are worthy of having their needs met. We in the church need to be assertively speaking back against unhealthy one-size-fits-all applications of this serve others rather than yourself theology. We need to speak truth to unhealthy blanket statements that can hurt people if used indiscriminately. I'd like to share a couple of examples with you that I saw this week. I think they speak to this poor theology in general more than speaking directly to the serve others statements. But they're still good examples, I think, as we talk about harmful ways that we talk to one another. The first example I found was on Facebook. The quote was, "God will never give you more than you can handle." Nate Postlethwaite responded with, "This dismisses the reality for many who could not handle it, who did not or do not have the proper support or resources to overcome hardships. We have got to stop adding toxic religious quotes to other people's unnecessary pain." I have learned that God will never give you more than you can handle can really be better translated in our Christian language as God will be there with you no matter what troubles, in all troubles that you have. Totally different way of looking at our faith and our God. I also saw this statement many times this week. "Ladies, it's fall. It's about to get dark earlier. Make sure you fill up your gas tank prior to nightfall. Keep an extra phone charger with you at all times. Sign up for AAA. Check your tires and oil. No ATM runs in the evening. Park in well-lit areas. Only unlock your doors if you are immediately ready to get out. Pay attention to your surroundings. Heads up, phones down. Stay safe, queens." Every time I read this, I thought of the woman in Marjorie's story. She would come to my mind, and I would think of how she probably feels less than her husband, how she needs help and direction, how she needs to be careful out in the world without her protector husband. Each time I saw this advice to women, I would comment with, I would prefer to read either, one, men, it's fall, it's about to get dark earlier, don't hurt or attack women. Or better yet, two, everyone, it's fall, it's about to get dark earlier, stay safe. That's inclusive, that includes everyone. It doesn't hurt anyone. Either the women that are hearing this message or the men that are having this message spoken against them. There are many times we say things to another person or hear statements from others said to us when the speaker has not fully thought through what's being said or has not taken into consideration the larger picture of loving others and reconciliation. Reconciliation and self-care. Caring for ourselves and caring for others. I think that's what a life of faith is all about. Matthew 22:36-40 says, "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" Jesus replied, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself." All the law and prophets hang on these two commandments. And I think so many people do not hear that little word as. Love your neighbor as yourself. I believe that God is very present in me. I believe that God is very present in all of you. I believe God is in me reaching out to you, and God is in you reaching out to me. I have done this sermon before in pre-COVID times, and I had members of the congregation at this time reaching out to take the hands of people around them and encouraging each person to reach out for the hands of others until we were all standing in a circle. So I want you to just imagine that we're standing in a circle holding hands. This is my understanding of a ministry of reconciliation and a ministry of care for ourselves and for others. People reaching out to one another in the presence of God because of the presence of God. Amen.